Drawing realistic looking foliage, particularly in pen, can be a struggle. There is no set of magic marks to create a foliage effect. Every tree is different, and how we draw even the same tree is affected by the size, the scale, the distance, and the speed of our drawing. But let me quickly show you 24 different sets of marks that I've used to capture different trees in different contexts to help inspire and develop your observation and mark making skills in this very important but tricky subject area. Let's start. For our first tree, it's these bunch of leaves hanging into our frame in the upper central part. I'm observing carefully. Careful observation is always the starting point for foliage. What's the shape of the leaves? How do they hang? And so forth. So I'm trying to capture some individual leaves because these leaves are so close, we see them all individually. And I really want to get that sense of closeness because that will create a greater sense of depth in our scene from closest to furthest. Now I'm doing the tree on the right-hand side. And these leaves, these needles, in fact, hang very differently. They sit upwards in bunches, in almost fists of fingers, and they create a very different effect. It's very, very vertical. And there's also a part where there's so many of them that I'm not drawing the individual ones. I'm not creating a silhouette. I'm creating a massed effect. And that is a slightly different technique to the one I'm using for the, if you like, showcased ones. And this is how these looked in this very brisk drawing that I did. Starting with the one on the left. Now, the shape of the branches is the main thing, this upward sweep, and just small bunches of leaves hanging to those branches. I think that's actually because this was spring and these leaves hadn't fully opened. So it creates a very distinctive pattern or visual effect to see. Now for the tree on the lower left, the pine tree, I think it is. In this case, it's the overall effect from this distance that we want to capture. The dark value of these pines clumped together, of these pine canopies. But we still do want to work on capturing the silhouette. When we have mass leaves that are close together, capturing this silhouette edge is a very important part, both of creating realism, but also interest. And I'm doing some extra hatching to indicate some of the shadows. And here's how these trees looked in this brisk drawing that I did earlier. So for this one, I'm afraid I took a photo when I thought I was recording. So I'm just adding leaves, some marks for this upper left fir tree that's overhanging. It's a shame I missed this one because these have quite distinctive marks, but again, it's very careful observation to see what am I looking at, and then not thinking of drawing a tree or a fir tree, but how do I replicate those in marks? And so quite brisk, downward sloping, the hang of these branches, the hang of the needles is very important. The next tree, the one under it, is still some sort of pine tree, some sort of cypress perhaps, and it's still made up of needles, but they're different type and they're shorter and they clump together so thickly that they actually create an impenetrable visual barrier. And so it's trying to capture a sense of the clumps that I was after just in that one. Now, behind this church, we have these tall, I think they're cypress pines. Now, again, trying to capture the effect with very different marks. I'm using lighter marks because these trees are further away. Their local colour is a bit lighter as well. I wanted to create the cylindrical effect with my marks, as well as paying attention to the silhouette edge. Because they're relatively simple, I wanted to capture all the distinctive markings on them that I could. And finally, we have this tree on the right-hand side, lower right-hand side. Again, I think it's some sort of pine tree, but I'm not trying to work out exactly what it is. I'm looking to see how does it look? What's the overall effect, and what marks can I make to capture those effects? And because it is a dark colour and parts of it are in shadow, I've gone very dark with this, and that contrasts with the value of the marks I've either used or created with the other three types of foliage in this scene. And here we see them as well as a nice hedge in the finished product from a fairly recent video. Now, with this tree, it's a specimen tree rather than a support act tree, which is what the previous examples have been, where this tree is the subject, but again, the principle's the same. Visually, what's the effect at a glance? What are the overall shapes? How are the leaves bunched together? And how are the bunches of leaves bunched together in canopies? Not to mention the branches, of course. How do the branches twist and turn? What angles are they at? And also, what value is there? How is there light and dark because of the way these leaves and canopies are formed? With this fir tree, it's really the silhouette shape that counts. Very distinctive, but there are so many different types of firs. The way the branches hang, and that can change depending how high up on the trunk they are and how the needles are attached, whether it's directly to the branches or in secondary branches or secondary clumps. It can take a little bit of time to do fir trees because there is quite a lot of verticality texture to create. Here we go. And add some marks for the branches that we're looking straight on at. And this is how it looked. Now this is from a video on how to create the effect of different trees. So I want to look at 4 of these trees, and we'll start with the one on the left, the really wispy effect. It's an Australian casuarina, an Australian fir tree, and it has a very light, delicate touch. So I want lines that are light and delicate and that angle up where the needles angle up away from the stems in the way that we have in our reference. Now for the main tree in the centre, there's a lot more work, there's a lot more leaves, but there's enough leaves also that at some point we need to stop drawing leaves and just draw in the effect, the values, some of the silhouette edges. It's important that we don't get stuck drawing every leaf, because if that happens too early, we can end up not knowing when to stop doing it, and our trees can look surprisingly unnatural. So here I'm again particularly paying attention to the edges, to the outlines, to the silhouettes, and to where the values are, where the darks are and the lights are, and trying to create those values in my line work, in my hatching. So very dark sections for the darker shadows, and lighter sections where I hatch more lightly over smaller groups of leaves. This was the tree that certainly took the most time for this video. Now we're doing the tree on the right hand side. This one was a bit tricky because it's a eucalyptus tree. The leaf load is fairly light at the moment because the tree is in blossom and has some cream gum blossoms that sit at the top of the bunches of leaves. And I think I probably did a better job in the actual video drawing, so you'll get to see that in a minute, and that might be a better one just to freeze frame and have a look. Again though, trying to capture the feel of the branches and the way the canopies and the blossoms are held at the tips of the branches by this outward spray of small twigs, a bit like fingertips. And for the final one from this scene, it's a tree that's pretty much below the one we've just drawn. It's really a large shrub. It's some sort of acacia, some kind of wattle tree, as we call them. Very distinctive silhouette in the photo effect of these branches and leaves. So I want to really capture this short, spiky, but also curved effect. And where there's quite a few of these branches overlapping visually in front of each other, we get a darker effect. So again, I want to take opportunity to create that effect as well. And here we see the 4 trees in the drawing that went with the video. Now, this is an example of marks that are suitable for an incredibly quick drawing. This was a drawing that took just a couple of minutes in real life for the video. lovely view of Sydney Harbour. And so it was a very brisk gestural mark making for this eucalyptus tree. And now we do the same tree for another video, taking a little bit more time. And so this shows the difference that the time we spend on the drawing will take, whether it's an incredibly fast gestural drawing, whether it's more moderately paced but still fairly speedy drawing as this one is. And of course what I should do is do a video where I draw this scene in some detail and see just how does that affect the marks I use. But as I said in the introduction, the marks that are appropriate all depend on the effect that we want to create and the conditions under which we're drawing, including the size. If our drawing is very small, that will change the marks that are appropriate that create the best effect than if our actual paper size in our drawing is much larger, where we can create marks to show more detail than if the drawing is very small. And it's very helpful for us artists to know what our sweet spot is, what's the size, what's the scale that our marks work best at, our natural mark making works best at. And here we have the first, I think that was literally a 5-minute drawing, and this was a 15-minute drawing, I think, of the same scene. So now we have a French cottage in the gardens of Versailles, and we're doing the tree on the extreme left. Now this is an example of marks appropriate for a tree that's some distance. We really want this to sit right back to help create the sense of depth in our scene. We've got more significant objects closer. And so it's very light. I don't want to create much value. Now I'm doing the trees in the upper right, and there's two trees here. There's a closer one and there's a further one. For the closer one, we can see the individual leaves. They're quite large, so I try and create that effect by drawing some individual leaves and bringing some nice contrast up against it. Then for the further leaves, it's a much smaller, more gestural effect. Here we see it for the video that the drawing was done for. And now we have another scene from the Palace of Versailles. The first one we're doing is the tree in the upper right. And it's a fairly large tree, but again, it's some distance in the background, so I want to use a light touch with it. I don't want it to come forward. I want it to sit well behind that beautiful pavilion and the darker fir tree in the front. Quite a bit of hatching though to create the value for the colour as well as the shading and the shadow. And there we have it. And now I'm doing the darker fir tree at the centre, sitting back behind everything. Now I'm just trying to see this just as a shape. I'm not really thinking of it as a tree. We certainly can't see the individual needles. So it's really the way the clumps of canopy sit on the tree and therefore capture the light. And there's almost a spiraling pattern of canopy clumps that's capturing the light, corkscrew effect. So I'm trying to capture something of that without making it look too precisely that. Always want to have an element of randomness in how our trees look, unless they've been particularly shaped. And now we have the fir tree in the center left. Now this is a great tree because the branches again are very distinctive. The way the needles sit and clump are very distinctive and create a great contrast to the pavilion behind, both in shape and in value, and also to the other foliage that we have in the scene. So this is the sort of tree that I do enjoy drawing, but it's also the sort of tree that does require a time commitment. It's not one that can really be rushed, because to capture the effect, the marks need to be quite small. So that's just how it is. And here we have it in the finished drawing from the video. Now, in this one, I'm drawing the tree right in the center. There's actually two trees, a large tree and a small tree in front. And then I'm going to draw the trees above it in the same style, but just to show the difference of the mark making where distance is important. This tree is already some distance from us, the one in the center of the scene, just on the other side of the river. And again, I'm really just trying to capture the light and the dark values and create an edge that looks realistic. And then for the tree behind, it's very similar, but it's a much lighter touch. And you can see that on the tops of the trees, I'm working hard not actually really to define them very much at all. Because I'm stacking some layers of trees above each other, I can let the shadow of the above tree define the top of the one below it. And this is how it looked in the original video. Now this is another very gestural tree for a very gestural drawing. We're doing the one on the lower left-hand side behind that van there. And it's a very different feel and look to some of the others. And here we see it in the video drawing. This final example is actually at 4 times my real-time drawing speed, as opposed to the double time that all the rest of the clips were. And that's because there is a lot more marks that we have to make to create the effect of the foliage that we want here. Because here we're seeing branches of a fir tree that has very distinctive branches. So we really want to capture that feel. But the most distinctive branches are in full sunlight. And we actually see them clearly and distinctively because of the shadows behind them. So we need to draw the shadows. We need to get the edges, the silhouette edges, nice and reflecting of what the real shapes are. And then lots of nice dark lines to create a nice dark background to really punch the shape of these fir branches forwards. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this interesting, and if you've watched till this point, please hit the like button, leave a comment, tell me if you found it helpful or not, and if you haven't subscribed, why not? Trees and foliage are an endless sort of drawing issues, both from drawings I see, but also from comments that people make. It's really important to observe what we're seeing carefully and to draw the effect of that particular foliage. A common mistake is to have a pattern to draw that in our mind we think this represents foliage. In effect, it's a symbol that we just use whenever we see foliage. And yet, even trees that are relatively similar in some ways in their foliage still are quite distinctive in others. And we lessen the interest of our scene if we make all the foliage look fairly similar. And almost regardless of what subjects we like to draw, we end up having foliage appear over and over again one way or another. So look, why not go to my foliage playlist where you'll see most of the videos I took these scenes from, and you can hear me explain my particular techniques and principles for drawing trees and foliage in much more detail. It's not as hard as it feels. It all comes down to the way we think and the way we observe. So let me help you in that, and check out my playlists on drawing trees. But look, whatever you draw and however you draw it and wherever you get the inspiration or the reference to draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.